we're looking at research planning, design, strategy, and information. And I think today we would look at where sources of information are. We have got, for an example, primary sources of information and secondary sources for the purpose of this presentation. But later on, towards the end of the presentation, we would look at literature review, how we should do it, what it is, then to try to understand how one conducts a literature review. I thought we should have dealt with this earlier on, but we were still busy with other themes. As an introduction, the first slide is actually to introduce the topic. It says, often organization members want to know everything about their products, services, and programs. And the research plans depend on what information you need to collect in order to make major decisions about a product, services, and program. Usually, you're faced with a major decision due to, for example, ongoing complaints from customers, need to convince funders, bank, and loan for money. This only shows that every research that is conducted has a basis. In other words, it has to address a challenge that is there in an organization. But in terms of academic research, we don't do it necessarily because we are from our employees, from our employers. We're doing it to achieve our qualifications. But in real life situations, people are doing research because they want to address a challenge. For an example, if an organization has got challenges in terms of the product that they're selling, whether customers are satisfied or dissatisfied, they might commission a survey or a research to find out how they can improve service delivery, how they can satisfy their customers. So that would be the rationale for why people should undertake research. Now, the more focused you are about what you want to gain in your research, the more effective and efficient you are. And the shorter the time it will take you, ultimately it will also be cost effective. And they are again saying it that if research is vaguely defined, if someone does not know why they are conducting the research, they will not be efficient and they will not be effective. They can pour a lot of money to go and collect a lot of data, but if it does not assist them in helping their challenges, in other words, if they are not focused, it will just a waste of money. There are in addition trade-offs in breadth and depth of information you get. For an example, if you want to go very deep in examining a specific aspect, the understanding is you won't have the necessary capacity to go very deep in every aspect that you are investigating. But if you select some aspects where you dig very deep, you can spread your resources over a wide area, knowing that somewhere you will go superficial, in some instances you will go very deep. That is why here they say the more breadth you want, usually the less depth you will have. In the same hand, on the other hand, if you want to examine a certain aspect of a product or service or program, if you want to do it in great detail, you will likely not get as much information about other aspects. In other words, it is better to have few selected cases where you dig very deep, whereas in other cases you just go broad. Those starting out in research or whatever, or who have very limited resources, can use various methods to get a good mix of breadth and depth of information. They can understand more about certain areas of their products, services, or programs while not going bankrupt in doing so. So in other words, that is what we're saying. You go deep in another aspects, whereas in other aspects, you don't go very deep, so that it will allow you to have a coverage, a wider scope of coverage, as well as a mix of the depth. In other words, I've got something very deep. I also have an opportunity to cover a wide area. And when you want to interject Buhle, please do so. Is that Buhle who is left here? Please do interject, and I will give you some times. From time to time, I will pause to give you an opportunity to ask questions. Now, the key consideration in we need to consider for what purpose is the research being done. What do you want to be able to decide as a result of the research? Do you want to inform a policy position? Do you want to revise a policy? Or do you want to improve service delivery? And I've made an example of if customers are not satisfied with a product, do you want to improve the sale of the product, or you want to redesign the product so that you package it better, or you bring in a good flavor so that you market it better? This can only be done when you have asked yourself first, what do you want to do? I want to improve my product, or I want to satisfy my customers. Who are the individuals or groups that will be interested in the results of the research? Because donors, management, employees or employers or customers, all of them have got different needs. And donors would need a specific output because they know that they're investing money. If they invest money, everybody wants value for money. If there is a donor or somebody giving you a loan, they want return on investment. If it is you, the management that is asking one of the employees to undertake research and they fund it, they must also benefit in that it must feed back into their management processes or into their policies, into their strategies. The same applies to customers or to employees. Everybody has got a specific expectation. So when I conduct a research, I must have a targeted, let's say, I must target a group. Who do I want to satisfy? For who? For what purpose? For who must I conduct this this report? Who will use the results? And then the other one is what kind of information is needed to make the decisions you need to make and or inform your intended interested parties. Those above that we've mentioned. How deep and how wide do we want to collect? Do you want a lot, very deep information, or as we have said earlier on, is it over a broad area but with superficial information? All these are things that we must ask ourselves even before we could commission our research project. And if we do that, then we are going to be focused and we're going to have value for money. The investment that we will make will indeed yield good results for purposes of the customers that we want to satisfy. Do you need information to really understand a process, such as improved public service delivery, the strength and the weaknesses of program like the Sustainable Livelihoods Program, or the benefits of to society? Do you need information just to understand that? From what sources should the information be collected? You can collect information from employees, customers, groups of employees, or groups of customers, or from documentation. And we've already said that we might be having target groups, and you might find that the target groups even becomes sources of the information. They are the people who must tell us, for example, if it is customers that are using our product, they are the ones who should tell us how they have experienced the use of the product. How do they think we can improve? How do they think it will be acceptable to them? So still, there are sources of information. And if we can understand what their needs are, we will be able to address their needs better. So this is what is said to be important for us to ask even before we can commission. Further, how can that information be collected in a reasonable fashion? What is the method of doing it? Are we going to issue questionnaires? Are we going to do it via interviews? Will we do content analysis by examining documentation? Will we observe a group of residents or employees involved in the program? Or we will do it via focus groups? These are the different methods that are available in conducting research. And I think you might be familiar with this. And I hope you're not doing your research for the first time. When is the information needed? By when must it be collected? It must be time-based. You see, a research project sometimes has got time limitations, in that if an organization wants to solve an existing problem by a specific time frame, then a person who they are employing to commission a research on their behalf will be given time frames that will give you this much, but you bring the results within 6 months or within 5 months, so that we can be able to address the problem that we are faced with. What resources are? In most cases, if it is an organization, they will always have a budget, and they might have budgeted for this at the beginning of the financial year, that this year we will do a survey on customer satisfaction so that we can improve our product. And if it is somebody conducting research for purposes of academic, they might be having bursary, or they've got a specific budget also set aside for conducting field survey. If someone is going to drive around, if someone is going to hold workshops and interview people, to meet people, to bring people together, might require resources, the venue. Maybe you have to pay for the venue, or you have to drive to where the respondents are. So all this entail cost, and it is important to understand if there is available budget to cover all the costs for traveling, for facilitating workshops, and many more others. Now, this slide has been addressed in earlier workshops, also be addressed, and it talks about basic and applied research. In that, basic research is designed to add to an organized body of scientific knowledge, and it does not necessarily produce results of immediate practical use. But applied research is undertaken to solve an immediate practical problem, and the goal of adding to scientific knowledge is secondary. In the process of doing that, the outcomes and the results also add into the scientific knowledge, into the body of knowledge. 2 months ago, I think it was last month, when we cited an example of a cholera outbreak, which was at Hammanskraal, that if one was to commission a research on how to address cholera at Hammanskraal, it would be referred to as applied research. But if one was to go and investigate causes and the sources of cholera at Hammanskraal, that does not solve. It will not solve, because it will only inform the investigator, the researcher, where the source is, where the cause of the problem is. But the earlier one, which is applied, how do we address it? How can we stop it? How do we ensure that cholera does not continue? Then it is applied in that it is going to solve an existing cholera problem. Can I pause here to give you an opportunity if you want to comment?
What I want to ask about gathering information, if you can please just go back to the slide, if you don't mind, where you mentioned that you can use interviews, questionnaires, and yeah, that one. So do you always have to follow like that process? What I mean is that if you are doing a questionnaire, it must be a questionnaire, or can you mix and do a questionnaire and an interview in your research, or does it have to be one of those?
You are okay. Let me give other colleagues an opportunity to make comments before I come in. Okay. Colleagues, you are also welcome to make comments in the way that you understand the research process.
Yeah, I think from my end, as you have correctly stated, that it depends on the type of the research that you'll be doing. In order to collect more and appropriate information, I think you should use the combination of the interviews as well as the questionnaire. Thanks.
There was a session where we were looking at data collection instruments. And all these that you are seeing here are potential methods that we can use. And they depend on what you want to get. Then they depend, you've got your research questions, you've got your research objectives, and you have got what you want to achieve. So your data collection instruments, your method is informed by what you want to achieve. And we noted that in survey, for an example, in a survey, we noted that you might even use mixed methods. And mixed method means that you are using quantitative and qualitative research methods. So, and in research, it is recommended actually using more than one method is recommended, because it assists you to actually validate your findings. Because you will find that the other method has got a specific strength which the other one does not have. So you then benefit from the use of the two. So I think we cannot be dictated to say you only use one. For an example, I was in the field one day and I was actually doing face-to-face interviews. And while I was in the field, I was using systematic, it was systematic sampling design. I could collect a sample from the first house, then count 1, 2, 3, then the fourth one, 1, 2, 3, then the fourth one. I was doing that. But when I went to a rural area, it was in the far north, in the former homeland of Venda. Now it is Vembe District Municipality. When I went there, some of the settlements were not demarcated formally in straight lines. And then the homesteads, the households were scattered all around. So there it was difficult for me to count 1, 2, 3, 4 in a straight line. And I could not even skip the 3 households. Then I had to devise a strategy for myself. Decide that, okay, I'll skip a house 1, 2, 3, 4, then I'll go to that other one. 1, 2, 3, 4, I'll go to that other one. I was using systematic sampling design, but I could not do it. It was not implementable in a rural area because it was not in a straight line. Then I said, I made sure that I'm flexible enough because this was, it is social research. Then I was flexible enough, devised a strategy to ensure that I don't leave the field without collecting data. Then, in other words, then I was not bound to what I had proposed in the proposal, because when I went to the field, the environment was difficult. Then I had to adapt to what the environment was presenting to me to ensure that I collect data. So I would say you are not forced to do one, you can do more. Actually, they recommend triangulation because it ensures validity of. Can we proceed? We were talking about the applied and basic research. We have skipped this slide. Now we're coming to research information and sources of information. That is where we're going to look at the different sources where we get our information when we conduct research. Good research depends upon good information. That is a fact. The required information should be obtained with the use of the most efficient methods possible. Efficient in this context means that those methods that will obtain the required information with the lowest possible levels of time, money, and manpower, while still maintaining accuracy and completeness. You will see that the authors continue to emphasize the efficiency, and they want us to spend less but achieve more. And they know that if we spend more time, we spend more money. And if we have got a lot of manpower, we spend more money. So they want us to look at the possible means: less time, less money, and fewer human resources. And that is where we would be efficient. But we must be able to yield good results from the investigations that we do. Remember, most of these aspects of research information must be considered and decided upon before data collection takes place. Yeah, in other words, it happens early at the planning stage. How much time will I have? You see, in research proposals, I see towards the end of the research proposals, some universities would require, or study leaders would require a student to indicate time frames, the cost and the budget by when the field work will be commissioned, by when the entire work will be completed. So I think this is also in line because people need to indicate when to start and when to finish. So you would be able to see how much resource will be invested in executing the entire research project. The levels of information that you wish to obtain for your research are strongly dependent upon the types of sources of information that you can access. For purposes of this research, a distinction is made between primary and secondary research data. Basically, this distinction illustrates the degree to which the author is removed from the actual event being described, thus informing the reader as to whether the author is reporting first impression. You see, in research, you can report your first impression. You can report information as first-hand, as having been experienced by you as a researcher, or you can report information that is secondary. In other words, you would be looking at other reports or other documents that have been compiled by others. So these are the two different sources of information, and in research we use all of these. Now, if we look at primary sources, these are contemporary accounts of an event written by someone who experienced or witnessed the event in question. And the original documents include the diaries, the letters, the memos, journals, speeches, manuscripts, interviews, and other such unpublished works. They may also include published works such as newspapers or magazine articles, photographs, audio or video recordings, research reports in the natural or social sciences, as well as original literary or theatrical work. This is a grouping of what can be considered as primary sources. In other words, they present first-hand experience, but they are important as sources of information because these are very original sources. I was looking at, I read something from, I Googled and I noted that there is a country in Africa where manna is still falling. And I wanted to read from a source. When I looked and had a search from the internet, the only original document that I found was a letter that was written by a person who used to be a station manager. It was in a church. It's a person who used to be a manager of that station, a mission station. And there they could talk about the manna that falls. But if you go into the internet, you even find some clips of videos showing people collecting manna and showing people talking about this manna. And they confess that even today, that manna is still available. But if I'm going to make reference and to quote any source, the very original source that I could quote, I noted that it was a letter which was written by one of the missionary. Any other information would have been secondary because it would have quoted that original letter that was written by somebody to another missionary station. So this is what constitutes primary sources of information. The following should be answered in terms of primary sources of information. What primary information will you need for the research project? This is what a researcher must ask himself or herself. And where will you get it from? Then somebody must be thinking, if my research topic is focusing on this, what is the possible area? What would be the possible sources for accessing the information? How will you obtain it? How will you ensure internal validity? What external validity will be obtainable? So these questions will assist us to actually be ready to go and access specific sources. And in terms of secondary sources, the function of these is to interpret primary sources and can be described as at least one step removed from the event or phenomenon under review. We just heard that primary sources of information are first-hand information. But here is a second step. If I'm quoting somebody who wrote about the manna that fell in one country in Africa, or I'm quoting about an event that happened, the tsunami that happened in Cape Town, and somebody has already written about it, then the information, the source of information becomes what I'm writing now becomes a secondary source, because I'm quoting the primary source. So this is the difference between the two. Secondary sources materials thus interpret, they assign values to, they conjecture upon and draw conclusions about the events reported in the primary sources. So we can interpret and say, oh, this first account of the manna that fell in DRC in Congo was because people were hungry, was because people have prayed, any way in which I can interpret. So this is referred to as a secondary source, because we assign values there and we interpret and we draw conclusions on them. These are usually in the form of published works such as journal articles. This is what is available for researchers, and books. They are always available for us, whether they are e-books or whether they're hard copies. These are what we access. And these days, most of the institutions actually are supporting e-learning, and most of the resources would be available from their web-based sources. So it becomes easy for us not to run around to go to physical libraries to go and look for this, unless if not available from the web, then we are bound to run up and down like we used to do in the past. By the way, in the past, most of the things were hard copies, and these things have to be handwritten and later on be translated into typing. So it is different from today. Today we have got physical books, we have got e-books, we've got web-based resources, and we've got physical library-based resources that we can use. And this is what a researcher needs to ask himself or herself about sources of secondary sources of information. What secondary information sources can you identify for your research project? Is it journals? Is it books? Is it e-books? Is it hard copies that you will only get? How will you access it? And how will you assess it? No, it is important. Somewhere when you assess some material are classified, you have to pay for that, you have to follow the PAJA. Later on, I will indicate where some resources require permission and where they involve cost. You have to pay for that. But if you are working in an organization and they've got policies or they've got reports that are related to the topic that you are researching, you've got free access to that. You don't have to pay for that. You just have to access to that. If they want you to declare or to undergo an internal process to ensure that what you use for your studies will give back to them, then it is an internal process that you must follow. When evaluating primary or secondary sources, there are questions that might be asked to help ascertain the nature and value of the material being considered. These are the following ones. There are many of them here. Maybe I might not even read of them. How does the author know these details? How does he know the name? How does the author know the dates? How does the author know the times? Was the author present at the event or soon after the scene? Did he hear it from somebody? Where does this information come from? Is it personal experience? Is it from eyewitnesses accounts? Or is it the reports written by others? In which case, if they are written by others, they are secondary. And if someone is an eyewitness, then that is a primary source of information. Are the author's conclusions based on a single piece of evidence, or have many sources been taken into account? Colleagues, if you want to validate and if you want to strengthen your cases that you make about your literature review and about the arguments of your findings, it is very important to consider not less than 2 sources, because this will show that there are people that are supporting the idea. And if there are many people that do not support the idea, then those sources can also be referenced, can be cited to show that these do not support it. There are 5 that are supporting it, but 20 of them do not support it. Therefore, we take it that we go there along with those that are supporting, because there are many. But of course, this should be dependent on the validity of the arguments. So it can be asked, those many sources that have been considered, are they diaries, are they third-party eyewitness accounts, is it impression of contemporaries or newspaper articles? Those that we are quoting, are we quoting from various types of information, or we just quoting too many diaries, or it's just too many newspaper articles? And I want to say, I always am very sensitive if I'm using a newspaper article, unless if it is the first-hand information, if it's the primary information. If it is second-hand, things like newspapers, I try to run away from. Now let's just look at accessibility and availability of access to the required information. And then I make an example of if I'm at under UNISA, there is my UNISA. Does my UNISA have what I want? Do I have access to my UNISA? Or if not so, if a copy is only available from a physical library, would I be able to access the library? Am I registered with the library? Can I get it? Or if it is under the web, do I have access to Science Direct? How can I access this? Do I have access to any other electronic material, such as e-books? When access has been obtained, is it possible to gather the information together? You find that sometimes in other libraries, you cannot remove material, even if it is hard copy. You cannot remove it. You can only read it there and leave it there. Otherwise, if you want to take your copy outside, you have to ask for photocopies. You have to make photocopies so that you can go out with it. Sometimes, in the past, research reports were only available in hard copies. But these days, I noted that some universities even keep electronic copies. I don't know if these are accessible, but electronic copies of research reports are there. But in the past, these were just hard copies. Therefore, you could not be able to take it out, because you only find that in the library, there's only 1 copy, 1 or 2 copies. So if you take it away, some other people would not be able to have access to it. And confidentiality of information. Some information is confident and it's not open for access by everybody. I used to work for the Department of Water and Sanitation, and we used to collect water quality samples, and those are not accessible by everybody. They can only be accessed if somebody writes to us, and we can request them to apply. When they apply, they are following PAIA. This is the Protection of Access to Information Act. And based on that one, a fee is charged to somebody who would want to access this information. Otherwise, some information which is classified would not even be accessible. It's not every information that one can access. And as I've said, some information might imply a cost. So if you want to access some information, laboratory results from the municipality or from the Department of Water and Sanitation, you have to pay a certain fee. Can I again pause here and hear if there is a question from somebody or a comment that can be made? We continue with accessibility of primary sources of information. Accessibility and availability. Is all the information from one source relevant? Will extracting part of the information cause any loss of meaning? How much information will be sufficient for the proposed? Here, I just made in red here that a comment here that it's not every time that all the books from which we source information, we're going to use everything. Although here we're talking about primary information sources. A case of the project that I undertook, I was researching the role of Venda culture in nature conservation. And it was in 1997. And very little was written about the topic by that time. And here I wanted to understand the extent to which the Venda custom, the cultural practices, contribute to the conservation of natural resources. And there was no book about this. And the only account that I could find about the relationship between the Venda-speaking people, the Venda culture, and the natural environment was from historical books. And therefore, you could not find a book that is fully about the natural resources. You could find in a chapter where they describe the geographical location of the former Republic of Venda. You could go and find another paragraph where they're talking about the Venda custom of cleaning the fountains, of looking after the water resources. Then you could make an extract. So it is not true that every time a source of information is just specific to the topic that one is researching. So I think it is important for us to be skilled in our ability to research and to find what is relevant and what is not relevant. You would find that what is relevant to you is actually 1% of the entire book. It's just one chapter or just a section or a paragraph from one section. So it won't always be. So let us take that into account, and we don't have to throw books away because they don't read our topic, or our topic is not reflected on the outside of that book, or the table of contents does not specifically refer to our topics. But if we are clued enough on how to do literature search, then we will be able to investigate even the legal things that are inside, that are hidden, which are important for the conducting of our research, so we can be able to succeed. And about secondary information sources quality, then the questions would be, is the information valid? How was it originally compiled and processed? And in terms of research reports, particularly academic ones, we know that they are subjected to rigorous research process, that you've got to do a research proposal, that you've got to indicate methods, you've got to state the problem statement, you've got to have the research objectives, you've got to go to field work, you've got to do data analysis, you've got to interpret, you've got to report, you've got to do conclusions. Even when you have finished writing the report, the study leader has to read and sanction it, say yes, it is correct, and he has to make some inputs to correct you. Even it is still even going to the external examiner, who is going to validate, say, oh, yes, this has been conducted, scientific methods have been used, this appears to be a scientific document, this is acceptable in the body of knowledge, it is scientifically done, whether it is under the social sciences or the natural sciences. So all those things are very, very important. So we don't want to use some reports that do not have valid information. So we would be able to consider that. So some textbooks are there that are written about the topics that we know. Some journals also are also peer reviewed. They are not only passed, not only published if they are not good. They go rigorous examination and editing until they are correctly suit the format and the style of the journal under which they're going to be published. So these are some of the questions that are important in terms of the secondary information. What types of information or data do you need then? If you are a researcher, the type and required amount of research data is determined by the research questions. Yes. The nature of the data will also determine the method of collection. The nature of the data affects the analytical technique. Qualitative data, for an example, needs qualitative analysis. And quantitative data will also need quantitative analysis. And I think I might be giving an example here. This example that I'm presenting here, I just extracted it this afternoon from an earlier presentation about data collection. Here, I want to indicate that if you want to collect quantitative data, you must ask a question that requires quantitative answer. And I'm trying to answer these questions, colleagues. I'm going to answer the type and required amount of research data. The type of data is determined by the research questions. Here it is. Here, we were asking respondents about their educational level, that if they do not have, then they must, their response is to encircle 1. If it is standard 2, is 2. If it is up to 5, is 3. Is up to 8, is 4, and 10 is to 5, and the tertiary education is 6. You can see that here you just want a person to indicate the level of education. Therefore, he provides just the number. It is a quantity. Maybe this is quantitative type of a question. And then here, we've got a different one now. But it also requires figure. Number 8, for an example question number 8, it says occupation. What is occupation? Occupation cannot be written in numerical fashion or style. It will be written in words. It's either that I'm an engineer, I'm an examiner, I'm a teacher, I'm a lecturer, I'm a professor. You see, number 8. But this is different from what the response might look like for question 9. It says, which amount of money do you get per month? Now here, again, it needs a number. It's just like the previous one. Now you can see that the wording of the question would determine what data you are collecting. And that is the response that comes from a respondent. So I think I must move down here because I think I do have something which is more qualitative. Oh, no, this is when we were trying to explain. You see now, from what the responses came, we noted that we could make a narrative. So it shows that although we've been given percentages, we can then interpret and make an inference and indicate what this, why this percentage. Generally, for an example, generally the sample represents a low income sector of the population. That is my interpretation. Because what happened is the respondents just indicated what their incomes were. Then I infer, then I assign an interpretation. I say, oh, because they get this much, then it means the sector is of low population. Then I said only 35% of the respondents were employed. Of these, 66 were laborers, whereas 17 were professionals, and 17 again were self-employed. This is what the outcomes were. But all of these is because I've asked about the occupation and the income that people want. So it means the manner in which you ask a question, you are determining data that would come to you. So the type of information that you will receive is dependent on what you ask. Let me just see if I've addressed everything. The nature of the data affects the analytical technique. Oh, qualitative data, okay. Quantitative data needs quantitative data needs quantitative analysis. Okay, let's go to quantitative and see how quantitative data was analyzed. Here, we noted that we were given the okay, we were given the amount. Okay, we were given the amounts, and here now I think here I've confused the statement that the author wrote there, because here after I've received all those numbers, I explained them in words. Let me see. They are saying quantitative data requires quantitative analysis. I said laborers and the self-employed received the lowest income. That is not quantitative, it is qualitative. But it becomes quantitative when I put in brackets less than 2,000 per month. Less than 2,000. 2,000 is quantitative because it's a number, it's a numerical value of someone's salary. And I say, but professionals received from. If I say professional received from, that is qualitative now. But I mix qualitative and quantitative. Therefore, I was also interpreting. But there is an element of quantity here, although I was doing it qualitative. And the reason why this is like this is because under this study, I was using mixed methods where I used quantitative and qualitative data collection instruments. So it was quantitative and qualitative research methods. I want to stop here so that if somebody has got a question, we can entertain that one. And comments are also welcomed.
Okay, I'm not sure if it's going to be related to the data analysis. Maybe you are still coming to that in terms of when you're doing this data analysis, or rather when you're gathering this information, how do you now establish your sample size to make it valid?
Okay. We last week we were dealing with sample and sampling design, and under that we had slides that were focusing specifically on the population size, determining the population size, and there are guidelines that tell you if you have got, if your sample population is so small. Sorry, if your population is small, then you sample, you just collect data from the entire population. You don't sample, or you sample the entire population. In other words, but the higher the sample, the higher the population, then the less the sample. But the more heterogeneous is the sample, sorry, is the population, then the higher the sample size, and then the more homogeneous is the population, then the less the sample size. And I think because we have not dealt this with you, we can have it sometimes where we can dedicate a session on that. Then we will go to the sample and sampling design. Then that aspect of determining the size of the sample will come on under spotlight. Then we can do that. And just hold it, mark it, record it, so that at the end of this session, if we take it as a way forward, then we should have a dedicated session on it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other question? I've just done that example. Now I was showing you that if you, the way in which you ask questions, you must expect that the response, the data, is in line with your questions. So if it is qualitative, you will receive qualitative responses. If it is quantitative, it will be quantitative. Now, consideration in planning for information. Materials used to collect data must be well prepared and preferably pre-tested. And here they cite an example of a voice recorder and any other instrument that you're going to use to collect data. Sometimes the data collection instruments would be notes. Sorry, it would be a writing pad or a writing book where you would take notes. It means it must be available, or the pen must be tested to be writing well, so that it must not stuck while you were writing. So if it is a voice recorder, then it should be done well. If it is something, a camera or somebody taking a DVD, then that instrument must be tested, and it must not fail in the field, because you will go to the field and fail, then you have to redo the trip, and it becomes costing. Now, here is something important. Training invigilators or other persons who may be involved in the data collection process to ensure understanding, avoid pitfalls, and eliminate mistakes. You know, I was talking, there is a student that I'm supporting. I don't know if that student will join this group. She is doing PhD under UNISA. school public administration. I think I've been assisting her for the past 2 years in getting the proposal better. She got the proposal better and she submitted to the university, but it took very long for the ethics committee to clear her out so that she's allowed to go to the field. And she engages me last week. Then I asked her how she's going to conduct field empirical study to collect data in the field. She says the reason why she was also delayed in getting ethical clearance, it's because they wanted to make sure that she does not pollute the data itself during collection. And she eventually told me that it appears that they do not want her to personally or physically collect data in the field, but they want her to employ data collectors or people that will do field work for her. Then she will analyze data. And why? I said, why? Then she says, no, they want to ensure that I don't interfere. They want to ensure that I observe the ethics in terms of research. And then I felt, oh, they want to ensure objectivity. And I know she's studying urban decay, and I think her case study is the city of Joburg. But I have got a feeling that for most academic research, there is no need, if the research is not very huge, if the research project is not very huge, there is no need for us to train people to collect data for us. You see, I like to collect data on my own, and all of it, because I know that in the process of collecting data, you learn a lot. And I learned a lot in my first research project. I learned a lot because I used face-to-face interviews, and there it was me only. My response, it was a master's project in MTech, nature conservation, role of vendor culture in nature conservation. I had to interview 100 respondents. I physically interviewed all the 100 respondents on my own. And the extent to which I learned how culture contributes to conservation, I was overwhelmed. And I learned that I was indeed a student. Those respondents, the interviewees themselves were teachers to me. And I learned even the research methods, its application. You can see that if you're applying it wrongly in the field. Now that if you train people and you send them in all the challenges that they encounter, they are not going to be first hands challenges to you. They're going to be second hands, because they will tell you interviews, respondents refused entry. They didn't allow us to go into their homesteads. Or they said you didn't make an appointment. That experience is very, very important for a researcher, especially for starting researchers. And it builds you up, it builds your capacity, and it makes you very, very strong. And in future research projects, then you become a master. So, but unfortunately, this sister has been requested to go and employ data collectors. Now, it also continues to say, ensure that material, personnel, and any devices are continuously managed and controlled during the process. Ensure that sufficient time and resources are available. You see, when you are collecting data, you must remember when your respondents do not understand your questions, you must rephrase. And a better person to rephrase questions is a person who has designed the research project, the person who prepared the research proposal, and the person who has written the questions themselves, because he knows where the questions come from. Because later on, I will show you that it's better to do your literature research before you do fieldwork, because there it equips you to understand how to ask questions, because you already have identified the gaps in the research. You have already identified the gaps in the body of knowledge with respect to the topic that you are doing. So if it is done by you, then it is education number one, and you're going to do it perfectly. People are not going to give you wrong answers because they've been asked wrong questions, or the questions are interpreted wrongly. So if you are there and the questions are wrongly interpreted, then you can channel the people so that they can answer accordingly. Ultimately, all source materials of whatever type must be assessed critically. Even the most scrupulous and thorough work is viewed through the eyes of the writer or the interpreter. This must be taken into account when one is attempting to arrive at the truth of the event. That is why it is important not only to cut and paste some other people's statements, because when I use somebody's statements, when I make reference to the findings of someone or some statements from another book, it must be in line with my findings, and it mustn't just be just cut and paste because somebody has mentioned a word that I think is also in what I found out. No, that is not correct, because ultimately the report belongs to me. If I've written a very wrong report, I must remember, when I'm writing a report, I don't write it for myself. I write the report for a second person, for a third person. So when they read, they're reading me. So if I'm not telling them anything, then I'm telling them nothing. So you don't want to write a big book that doesn't say anything. You want to write a concise book that is well compiled with good references to show that this person has read the topic and he understands it. And this is the reason for literature review. And this is the reason for collecting the information, for knowing sources, primary and secondary sources to support the research process. And here I say, when you are doing research, it is unscientific to choose information that supports your predetermined outcomes of the research process. The researcher must not be selective, because during the course of collecting data or reporting the findings, some people tend to lean towards their preferences. They support a certain position. If you are researching on the venda culture and nature conservation, you want to say, no, venda culture indeed supports conservation, even if you know that there are instances where the culture goes against protection of the resources, because we know that in the rural areas, when by that time there was no electricity, and when people ran short of wood, firewood, they went to chop trees, wet wood. They chopped trees which were not dry. So that is not conservation. So let us analyze and find out why people present or exhibit certain practices and why is it reported like that. Then I don't have to defend it. Let me state the fact as it is. Then I will analyze. They are collecting wet wood because dry wood is not there. By the way, who would like to collect wet wood when there is dry wood? Under normal circumstances, in rural areas, in the venda areas, they will collect wet, dry firewood, because wet wood is not firewood. It's called mageda in venda. So I'm just saying, I didn't have to defend the position that I upheld. I must accept that they also destroy the vegetation, which is unwarranted, and they do this when they do not have dried wood. Other circumstances under which wet wood can be collected can be considered, and a specific recommendation can be made. That is when you are objective. Now, this is the hint. This slide shows, presents to us the hints about information sources. Now, here we start about primary information. We said these are direct observations or measurements by the researcher. That is when I'm collecting data. Surveys, personal interviews, questionnaires, telephone interviews, and panels. These are the methods that we've seen earlier on at the beginning, and we asked if we can only use one. We've agreed that we can mix them, we can triangulate, which is good. Observations, experimentation, usually unprocessed information or data. Researcher can assess quality directly. Researcher can decide what to include or to exclude. Researcher has control over the extent and type of processing. This is about the hints and about primary information sources. And it continues to say, get as much as you can and use what you get as much as possible. The following are important considerations: the ethics, confidentiality, and cost of collection. Ethics, we have said something about it there. Confidentiality, we spoke about classified information that cannot be accessed. The cost of collection, we said some information has to be paid for when you have to access, because it costs the department or it is not for public consumption. And in terms of in terms of secondary information sources, the hints are These are published materials which include information in libraries, journals, books, conference papers, statistical information, archival documents, speeches, monographs, official manual, reports, newspapers, magazines, and the internet. Some is unpublished material such as organizational records, records from the private organizations, government agencies, and parastatals. Acknowledge every source which is used. Use one source to identify the other. This one I have to caution that when we are reading, you might find that another author of a journal has cited another author. It is, to me, very dangerous to use that information which was cited by somebody without having read that information, because therefore it doesn't become secondary source to me. It becomes a third source to me, because it is a book that was read by somebody who has written in his book about that book. So the better way of doing it is to actually go and investigate, find out about that literature, go and read that secondary information. Then it becomes secondary information and it is user-friendly. And you will cite it correctly. Because if you have to cite what this person has cited, you must indicate that you are citing that something that the other author has cited. And this is double citing. And this is a manner in which it should be done in terms of the citation style, the Harvard style. But I was just cautioning that it's not good to quote something that was quoted by someone. Where do we find primary and secondary sources? Now let's start with primary sources. We find them from the local libraries. We also find them from UNISA libraries or the municipal libraries. They are from specialists and or experts in the topic you are writing about. Specialists have got this information. Opinions or comments of common people on the particular topic. If I'm collecting data, of course, and I'm interviewing people, they will make comments and they will tell me things about their experiences. So because I'm writing it, then it becomes the first, the primary source. Local bodies, if the topic is concerned with a public issue. And secondary sources, where do we find them? Dictionaries, encyclopedias such as Encyclopedia Britannica, newspaper clips, relevant books and journals. I think we have already touched this earlier on. The internet is a wonderful source of information. You can search in any of the well-known search engines. The only one that I know that I've used for academic is Science Direct, but sometimes I even got some good sources just from the general Google or Google Scholar. I did find some information. You find ebooks somewhere sometimes. Sometimes you can even find a journal. So this is the source of secondary information. And for what kind of information is the internet useful? Colleagues, while we're going to deal with this aspect of finding information, there is a specific way in which one needs to cite information from internet. There is information that would not have an author, and there is information that will have an author. So when we deal with citation, I think somewhere we shall have a workshop to talk about citing, how we reference, how we acknowledge sources. There is a style and standard, and one is specifically meant for acknowledging internet sources. So internet is useful for information that is very recent, information that is not likely to be published, such as the media statements, the press release, or political speeches. This is always there every day. We hear it from the, we read it from the papers, and we hear it from the radios and televisions. And information produced by government agencies, including policy documents, white and green papers, new strategic initiatives, and budget overviews. You find that these are not published, but if you go into the web, the government websites, they've got intranet and internet. You can access some of these documents, and some of them are very important for most of the topics that we deal with, because some of our topics even touch on government, on service delivery, on policies of government, or on on issues of social importance, which are addressed by government departments. So it is important to access this information via the internet, even if they are under specific government departments. The internet is also useful for information that is produced regularly but not regarded as worthy of publication in scientific publications such as annual reports, financial statements, mission statements, and technical reviews. I think we are all aware of these. Now, what is regarded as very important note on information that has been collected? It is said, never ever make the mistake of throwing away the data that you have collected. You must keep all information, notes you have made, interviews you have taken, photocopies and computer printouts of information. Keep it in a large envelope. This is just a suggestion. This will prove extremely useful when you do a similar project in future, or you need to do research along similar lines. And sometimes, even if you are still compiling your research report, you might find that you don't understand what you have written. But when you refer back to the notes that you have, or you refer back to the sources of information that you had earlier on, you get good clarity, the reason why you write a specific points. Then you can continue to revise and make corrections. Before I go to touch on literature review, I also want to pause here so that if there are comments to be made, they can be made and we can discuss them.
I have no comment.
Okay, thank you, Gugu. And Sifiso?
No, I just want to find out if one of the reasons why you have to keep your research, would it be because maybe you might be sued for probably stealing some information that was valuable for another researcher? Maybe you are receiving some royalties based on someone else's work. Thanks.
I don't understand the question. Sorry, can you repeat that?
All right. No, I'm asking if the one of the reasons why you have to keep your research, you said you keep your research, you put it in an envelope. One of the reasons was that for your future research that you'll be conducting. So I'm asking a question that will it be maybe one of the reasons that someone else can sort of like open a case or sue you for using his or her information somehow without his or her acknowledgement?
Oh, I think here they are advising us that if we have collected information, before we are sure that we will not need it in the future, it's better to keep it and maintain it, so that if at any stage there's a need to consult and refer to that information, you can still be able to go and find it and use it. But you see, in terms of ethics, you cannot conduct research if you do not have the consent of the people that you are researching on. Remember, even when you ask, say for instance, you're going to a rural area. Rural areas are under the chiefs or the idunas. If you want to conduct research in a specific village, you must go via a chief or an induna. So I remember when I was conducting research, it was under the Chivas tribal authority. I had to write a letter to the tribal authority. And even before they could respond to my letter, they summoned me to a meeting of the council where I explained what I want to do and what exactly I was requesting for. They could not understand the content of my letter. Then I explained, I request to undertake research here for this purpose and that and that and that, and my study area is under your tribal authority. So if that letter has been approved by the tribal authority and I keep it, actually I could keep it and work with it, so that wherever I go, if somebody finds me conducting research and say you are doing it without the permission of the tribal authority here, we will chase you away, then I know that the tribal authority will protect me because they gave me permission to do so. You see, now I think in terms of ethics, I can be protected if I've got a letter of authority or letter of approval to allow me to conduct research.
Okay, yes, now we have answered you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And welcome, David. David, welcome. David, you are muted. While David is responding, I want us to now continue and look at literature review. Here we will see why we do literature review and what literature review is. And when you want to interject, please don't shy. Do ask me questions even if I'm talking. I will pause so that we can discuss. What is literature review now? A literature review, this author calls it A. He does not say literature review. He says a literature review offers a synthesis of what has already been written on the topic, what has not yet been written on that topic, or what is written in such a way that it is conceptually or methodologically inadequate. It must also have the goal of clarifying and showing how the researcher's proposal addresses the gap, silence, or weaknesses in the existing knowledge. And you will remember that when we do a research proposal, there is what we call preliminary literature survey or literature review. That is that review is very, very important, because it will assist you not to focus your topic on things that have been researched. Because when you do literature review, you will find, oh, this has been researched. Oh, this has not been researched. This has been researched, but there is a gap. And the justification for conducting a research is the reason to close a specific gap. And that gap should be evident during literature review. So that's why they say the proposal should indicate the extent to which it addresses the gap that is there in the body of knowledge. So that is the purpose of literature review. Literature review is an informed assessment of the existing research on the topic under study. It demonstrates that the researcher has read extensively and intensively on the topic. This is indispensable for the credibility of a well-written, informed literature review. A literature review is a critical synthesis of the existing research and not an open-ended, long-winded description of what you said. You know, something which is very important. Remember, before you even conduct research, the institutions or any other organization that will request you to do research on its behalf, or if it is the university, they will also request you to prepare a research proposal. And when you prepare a research proposal, remember you have a study leader. There is a gatekeeper. Somebody must approve the research proposal. And we have learned in earlier workshops that a research proposal can also serve as a blueprint. It also serves as a program or as the terms of reference for the project. So you are only able to craft a good research proposal if you have read, because you must convince a study leader that, study leader, I understand this topic and I understand what I'm writing about. And this is the reason why I intend to research on this topic. And my research objectives are this. And this is how I can tell you what the problem is and how I will be able to solve it, even including showing the methodology. Most of the things are centered around reading and centered around studying, because that is where one empowers himself. So it happens even at an earlier stage when you are doing preliminary studies, when you are preparing a research proposal. But we do know that when you go further, you have got to have other chapters, chapter 2 and chapter 3. You might dedicate them on literature review. And that is where you need to go at depth to show that you understand. You have studied the topic inside and upside down. Now, this is the learning points. It says, present the literature that you have read in an organized and structured manner. Be fair in your treatment of authors. In other words, you cite them correctly, you don't misquote them, and you don't use their statement and without acknowledging their contribution. That is why there is a style and there's a requirement that any statement that you mention, it must show where it comes from. Avoid repetition or merely compiling a list of summaries without integrating your readings into a coherent text, because we don't just read books or literature in order to extract information and paste it in our proposals or in our chapters. We synthesize, we analyze, we make sense of what that statement is, and we write it in our own words. But we acknowledge that these statements are supported by specific authors whose book we have read. So it is very, very important. And a literature review is goal-focused. The goal is to identify the limitation of the existing research on a subject in order to justify the proposed research. This is what we were saying in the previous slide. In preparing for a literature review, progressively narrow down your reading of the literature as closely as possible to the topic. Colleagues, when I was studying the role of Venda nature conservation, the role of Venda culture in nature conservation, I noted that conservation was practiced formally, conventionally, from the Western perspectives. In other words, here in Africa, we were adapting Western concepts, foreign concepts of nature conservation. And therefore, when I was doing literature review, I could not shy away making reference to the international principles of nature conservation. I had to write that, and I had to indicate that the reason for my research is that it is unfair that the Bavenda continue to practice conservation from a Western perspective, whereas they've got their own culture, which is capable. I was arguing, actually I had an assumption that the Venda culture can protect and conserve the natural environment. So it means I would start my literature not only by reading what the Chivenda culture says. And by the way, Venda as land is located in South Africa. So I should say it within the context of South Africa. Also within the context of Africa, where South Africa is located. So my literature review would start from a very broad perspective. It will start broadly, but I would have to narrow it down. I would talk about conservation from Western perspective, then this is an international perspective of nature conservation. Then I had to come to African perspective of nature conservation until I say South African perspective and eventually the Venda perspective of nature conservation. And that is the reason why I said there was very few literature on Venda and nature conservation, Venda culture and nature conservation. But I was forced to narrow it down and say something narrowly about the Venda and nature conservation. Although there was a lot of books on international conservation and on conservation in Africa and conservation in South Africa, there was very little about the Venda. But I was forced, I had to write something. And indeed, I've done so. The literature review should end with an overview of the main conclusions you have reached. Yes, that's a good advice. These conclusions are essential because they would have informed and influenced the empirical part of your study. Now, when we are here, I want to say I have got a strong recommendation that it is important for any researcher to do the literature chapters. Chapter 2, if chapter 3 is also about literature, should be completed before undertaking fieldwork. Because when you do that, you study your topic inside and outside. When you go to the field, you are not going to be surprised and you're going to be spot on because you already know all the challenges and you already know everything that has been done, the gaps you master, and you have developed a strategy on how to ask those questions. You will be able to ask relevant and correct questions. You will do correct questioning when you have completed your literature chapters. And that is my emphasis, that please don't go to the field, don't collect data before you master and finalize literature chapters, because the gap will be discovered while you are in the field. Then you have to go back and then you redress things in a very challenging way.
I've got a question.
Yes.
In terms of literature review. Literature review, you said that it is to identify gaps and also limitations. Am I correct? Well, when you're doing the literature reviews, so the researcher identify the limitations on what has already been written on that specific topic that you chose.
Yes, I don't know if I understood you better. You were cutting a little bit, but let me try to answer. If I don't answer correctly, you will make a follow up. Yes.
Can I rephrase? I've got load shedding, so my network is not so great. Okay. Can I just re-ask the question? I'm saying that you mentioned that when you're doing literature review as a researcher, so the literature review basically identify on what has already been written in that specific topic of research that you chosen. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, it is correct. Yes.
Okay. Furthermore to that, then, isn't it also when you are writing your literature review, can you also not point out the similarities of what has been written in comparison to your topic?
Yeah, I think you are correct. You see, when we say you study, you then identify what has been studied already in the topic. We want to avoid repetition. If, say for instance, I was studying the role of vendor culture in nature conservation. Say for instance, when I did that, I find that somebody has already written about the conservation of animals through the vendor culture. Then I was going to justify my studies. Oh, studies are there about the vendor culture and conservation, but they only studied animals. What about plants? What about soil? And what about water? Then I would justify, I would say, although I would not study animals per se, I'm going to study the soil, I'm going to study the water, I'm going to study the plants, because these have not been studied. Or if a person only studied the mammals and did not study all the other animals, I will say, oh, Korombi studied the mammals, but there are insects, there are reptiles, those there are fish, those have not been studied. So I will exclude mammals that have been studied, but then I will confine myself to other aspects of nature that have not been studied. So I justify the reason why I want to study the vendor culture that has been studied. It is because it was studied from a different perspective. So I justify I want to venture into a new field. Then there is interest in the body of knowledge because it is new.
Okay.
Yes, that is the reason for us, for that statement that says you study what has been studied about the topic.
All right. Thank you.
And how do you view literature review now? Literature review is not an annotated bibliography or a list of sources. We are warned of this every time. It doesn't mean that it is just a list of what we have read. But it engages the student in a dialogue with the writings and arguments in their field. And it helps to set the pattern of critical thinking and good writing. That is why it would be important for us to understand what we want to research. You see, you would have your research objectives. After your research problem, you would your statement of research, a problem statement, you then have to craft research objectives. Then when you are doing your literature review, I think your literature review is centered on your research objectives, because it must actually assist you to address that statement of a problem, because there is a broader research question that you want to respond within the context of the research topic. So here is not a matter of just reading. You must think deeper, because you see, I believe that your literature should assist you to respond to the research objectives. That is in summary what I can say. But it is a contributor to shape the student's research, forms an integral part of a research, and should encourage a reflective approach to research. And what is its purpose? Literature review is an integral part of the logic of the research process. It will have to be done because you have a chapter on this. And I want to indicate that you will never write anything if you have not read anything. Right from the stages of preparing a research proposal, we have said you only are able to write a research proposal if you have read. Because if you think about a topic, you must go and investigate and read about it. Then more information comes in, then you are able to structure the arguments, to put a good background, to put a good problem statement, so that you are able to even put good research questions as well as research objectives. Literature review is an integral part of the logic of the research design. Yes, we've said that it triggers creative thinking and new ideas, becoming familiar with the subject area of the interests. Yes, indeed, it is correct. We have said it. Finding evidence in the academic discourse to establish a need for the proposed research. You see, you can find if the area has been over-researched, I'm not even interested on that. I'm interested on breaking new grounds, things that have never been researched by anybody. That is why when I researched on the role of vendor culture in nature conservation, it's because I had by then never seen any report on it, and I have not had anybody researching on it. So I felt, let me go and venture into this, so that it must be a new area where I can add into the body of knowledge. It helps to ascertain the nature of previous research. It helps to identify gaps in knowledge, indeed, and then that knowledge is what you want to close. And that knowledge, that knowledge gap is what you want to close, and this is what justifies your research. It helps to develop the context of a proper research problem question. You see now, because when you read, you delve deeper, you find the in and outside of the topic, then you are in a position to write the correct research question or the problem statement. It helps to identify the issues surrounding the research question. It helps to identify issues and variables related to the research topic. What do we investigate? What variables can we investigate? Then it only emerges when you do your literature review. And this is the reason why I say don't go to collect data into the field before you read your literature, because by then you would not have understood the variables. You will understand the problematic areas that need more probing, areas that need more questions, so that the gaps can be closed in terms of the problem statement. Literature review also helps to identify appropriate research methodologies and techniques. Yes, then you read, you must understand the type of the methods that you will use, and that is also from literature. And what is the purpose of literature review? As we continue, you see, it can also serve as a chapter in thesis or research report. We have already said that chapter 2 and chapter 3 might be the core of your literature review, but your initial review of the literature will go into your research proposal, into chapter 1. All your background and your problem statement, before you can even put your research objectives, those are part and parcel of your literature review. It will help you to establish a theoretical framework upon which a base to research. Theoretical concepts, we must understand from which theory we argue, what is the theoretical framework in relation to the topic under investigation. It justifies the need for a research Keeping abreast of ongoing work in the area of interest. Indeed, it's correct. Everything here is correct. Some of it might be repetitive, but it is an emphasis of what should be known and what should be taken into account. It indicates that the researcher is knowledgeable about the topic. And this is the reason why I say you need to use literature review to convince the study leader. And how do you get started now with the literature review? You start with the library, the internet, academic journals, and core books in the search for existing literature. And here I say, use your keywords. Remember your topic. If I'm researching the role of vendor culture in nature conservation, the keywords are vendor culture. The keywords are conservation. Those are keywords. Then if I go into vendor and conservation, then I will see something coming out. And if nothing comes out, it means there is little that has been written about it. So keywords are very important. Develop a plan and outline a structure for the literature review as early as possible. You put headings and subheadings, develop theoretical framework, draw up concept maps, develop a conceptual framework, summarize the main arguments as it relates to the current research topic. I just want to show you what came to my mind when I was researching the role of vendor culture in nature conservation. Look there at the top, we've got vendor culture and nature conservation. I've just put keywords there because the heading, the topic itself is very long. But there under the culture, I said the vendor culture has something to do with biodiversity. Biodiversity means living things, living animals and living plants, anything that is alive. And this is part of the natural environment that the vendor culture can protect or can destroy. Apart from those things that are alive, the vendor culture can also destroy the physical environment. It can damage water. That is why you see land and soil and water. Water can be polluted, land can be eroded in the way that we practice farming in the Chivela. So all these things came to my mind, and I put this mind map so that I can be able to club things, everything that relates to living things, to animals. I'll put them under animals. And under animals, you will have mammals, you will have insects, you will have fish, you will have reptiles. You have too many. Plants, you have got weeds, you have got shrubs, you have got large trees, you have got aquatic plants, you have got terrestrial plants, you have got different of them. So all of this is the manner in which I thought I can stimulate the packaging of the outcomes of the resources. What I read, I will package under this, and I can go down and subdivide these things into many things. And when you subdivide, you are creating chapters, you are creating sections, you are creating paragraphs, you are creating statements. All these things. When we go to how you present your report, we'll revisit this what I'm saying now, and see how you produce a research report. And it is logically based on what your findings are, and it is also in line with your literature chapters. Now, getting started again, review the selected literature, write as much as possible, restructure later, note briefly any other areas of arguments or problem your research touches on, formulate questions that the literature review should address. Examine literature reviews of these in the same area. Consult databases for abstracts. Review and critique the literature, paraphrase and avoid long quotations. These are just some of the guidelines that were being provided from literature. Now, what are good criteria for a literature review? And I think after this slide, we will have to pause. And here again, I want to make reference to the vendor culture and nature conservation. It's a case study that I'm trying to indicate here. Depending on the nature of the study, the criteria should include comprehensiveness. There, I don't have a comment. And specificity here, I'm saying, you see, the red is my response, and I'm actually analyzing what the author has written here. Was the literature very specific to the topic, focusing on my topic? I said when I looked at literature that talks about nature conservation in the Venda culture, there was none. Therefore, here I've put a no in red. Let's see. Authority. Is there any authority who wrote about Venda culture and nature conservation before I could undertake my studies? No, there was nobody, because most of the information that I found that spoke about the Venda culture was either from books of history that were not talking about nature conservation. It was just a section of an account of how the Bavenda relate to their natural resources, either to water or to plants or to animals. So there was no authority who wrote about it. Currency, latest thinking and writing in the field, there was nothing by then, because it was just nature conservation in general, international perspective, Western perspective, or indigenous knowledge in Africa. It was only that. So I said, no, there was nothing written about that at that time. Availability, no, there was nothing. There was no material available. I had to search to make sure that there is something that assists me to break the new grounds. Relevance, no, only material relevant to the problem, no. That I used was related to other aspects, either history or the economy or any other aspects, but I had to extract information that is related to the topic under investigation. Exclusion, material marginally relevant or relevant to the problem. No, this is not applicable because I didn't have to exclude anything, but anything that had something that was relevant to me, I had extracted. And when I've cited, people would even be able to see that those references were not necessarily about nature conservation or environment in the Venda culture. So I think I must pause here so that if there are questions, then let's entertain them, or other comments, so that we can have a way forward towards closure.